Harold said to me that after my first talk, I really showed my hand or displayed my creed. Is that the word you used?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to display my creed now. In terms, one of the reasons I'm so drawn to the Brompton notebooks is he uses examples from real life to illustrate a deep truth. And the story tells us, a very true one, a lady he knew was shattered after she lost her soulmate husband. So she went to Luxor to forget it all, rejuvenate. And an ordinary shoe shiner decided to polish her shoes. That night, she had an intense dream of that shoe shiner. And after she woke, she felt extremely comforted and very optimistic. Then as the day progressed towards evening and nighttime drew, she got again very, very depressed. Again that evening, she dreamt of the shoe shiner who had polished her shoes. And he said to her in the dream, "I'm helping you now. Next time you are on your own." And this is really what I feel. We can be drawn to any teacher, anyone we love, any book, but we are on our own. Do not be over-attached. There is a hell of a difference between love and attachment. Now, I mentioned the Brompton notebooks. And I say unashamedly, I believe that Brompton, Ramana Maharshi, Krishnamurti, in their totality, for me, are as important, not more, not less, as the Blavatsky theosophical teachings. However, in this last part, we touch on what is the most supreme contribution of the Blavatsky teaching. Really, for me, the most important, the most wonderful, and the crown jewel of the occult doctrines, besides our Occult-Genesis, that on evolution. And no one has remotely touched it in the way that the Masters and Blavatsky have. And why should they? Why repeat what someone else has done to such perfection? How silly. Actually, in the Brompton notebooks, we find one line on evolution. Man did not come from the monkeys, finished. And we have the whole of Anthropogenesis. So this is where each sage will deal with the practicalities and the situation now. Who would dare to bother with Anthropogenesis when we have this superb diamond teaching? So, in the Bible, in Genesis, we find that there were daughters, there are giants. Can you hear me? Yeah. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bare children unto them. And of course we have giants in Jack and the Beanstalk story, we have giants in the story of Ramayana. But then in Greek mythology, and I think, Michael, you might just, if I get my names back to front, you can correct me, but Zeus, his daughter Leda, was visited by Theseus, and she bore him 2 eggs, and those eggs were man-bearing. The eggs were man-bearing. And why do I say this? Because the ancient wisdom is encoded in symbolism, allegory, and mythology, especially the universality of tradition the world over across vast epochs of time. The ancient wisdom is not encoded in fossil records. And of course the most authentic source is the Book of Dzyan in its transformation or transmutation as Anthropogenesis. So the contents. The occult doctrine of anthropogenesis. We've seen the unproven premises of biology, and now I'm going to give you a synopsis of the whole story of human evolution, the correspondences between round evolution, root races, principles of man, and we will have a sort of a helicopter view of the first, second and third root race. The third root race being the most critical, where assistance was provided, the fall of the angels, the evolution of animals, further assistance, the origin of sin in the fourth root race, and the fifth root race where we talk about gods and dragons. We've dealt with the unproven premises of modern biology, so we'll move on to the principles of occult anthropogenesis. The overall principles, which are summarized a few moments ago, and it's worth seeing again. Right. There's no such thing as dead matter. Everything is conscious, and every atom and cell is a conscious unit that acts not only physically, but psychospiritually under law. Now, occult anthropogenesis affirms that man is of polygenetic origin, meaning new types of species have originated from more than one ancestral type. There was a variety of modes of procreation before the present mode of sexual generation, and the evolution of animals, or at least the mammals, follows that of man instead of preceding it. Man is the macrocosm of the three kingdoms below him. Mammals, we are told, the mammals are the cast-off dust, meaning the life atoms, meaning the vitality of man himself. And we'll come on to that. The mammals are the cast-off dust, the vitality.
Your shadow is...
Sorry.
Your shadow.
The shadow that life casts upon itself. Sorry. Right, I'll stand here then. I'm just trying to coordinate the mic. Right. Now, in a very simplistic sense, if you think that water flows downhill, it can only flow uphill by virtue of some mechanism. Heat flows from hot to cold, not from cold to hot. Electricity passes from a high voltage to a low voltage. Can anyone deny that? Right. Mm-hmm. So how can a low intelligence flow from a low to a higher level without assistance being provided to push that intelligence up? How can you be low intelligent, high intelligent, without something to drive it up? Unless the whole of nature be just a joke. Now, Simon Conway Morris, the Cambridge professor, as I say, is just about the only one who asserts now that all of evolution moves towards man as the final goal, as the apotheosis, the crown jewel. And I know it's a dense slide, I will read it out. Conway Morris, just this thing. No one doubts the fact of evolution, but unlike other sciences, it falls strangely short when it comes to prediction. Indeed, much of the current emphasis is on unpredictability. No humans, to give a trivial example, I will argue the exact opposite. Evolution is highly constrained, but the deep structure that orders things this way is now only being glimpsed. And then, if we put this statement of modern science against what the secret doctrine says, just this last sentence, from the beginning of the round, all in nature tends to become man. All the impulses of the dual centripetal and centrifugal forces are directed towards one point, man. So science is indeed our best ally and our best friend as well. We hear this word, the breath. The breath is the monad which cycles through all the kingdoms of nature, gaining experience. Now, of course, we are in the 4th round and the 5th race. Each round brings out one principle of man to culmination, to fruition. In the 4th round, the principle being brought to fruition is kama, desire. Each group race brings one sense from latency into objectivity. It's a little bit like my first talk when I was talking about the occult process throwing out everything that is latent. So there seems to be a grand occult process that brings everything from latency into objectivity. And that also corresponds with one of the elements. So evolution is the joint propulsive activity of the monad and the personal self. And it occurs on 3 parallel lines: the physical, the psychic or the psychospiritual, and the monadic, the psychic and the physical, the monadic, the psychic and the physical. Now the monad may be likened to the house dweller. The monad is the house dweller, but the house dweller needs the bricks, the physical material. He needs the spiritual model or prototype to shape the material. He needs the architect, and he needs an intelligent consciousness to guide this evolution, the builder or the builder architect. So in Genesis we have this saying, and the Lord God formed Adam out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Is it? Yeah, the breath of life. And man became a living soul. So, the Adam of dust requires the soul of life to be breathed into him. That is, the 2 middle principles, kama, desire, being the sentient life of the irrational animal, and manas, the human soul, that has to be breathed into him. Otherwise, he is not truly a man. So the importance of desire cannot be overemphasized. Desire is the upadhi, the base, the deposit, so to speak. It is the deposit for manas, the mind, to operate on earth. Manas needs a deposit, which is desire, to operate on earth, not somewhere else. That lovely saying, inculcate the spiritual monad of a Newton and graft it on the most beautiful saintly body of the saint, but if it lacks the 2 middle principles, you will have created an idiot, at least on earth, because you have not got kama and manas. Desire, the animal irrational soul; manas, the human rational soul. Now I'd like us to look at the principles of man in this sense, and some of you have seen this diagram before. It's always nice to invoke nature. The 7-fold constitution of man like this. So imagine you have a room, the ground floor of your house. You have an inner chamber with a bright light, and a fraction of that light passes through an aperture in the wall here, and of the total light only a fraction is caught by a mirror, which then reflects the light on across an outer courtyard through 5 dirty windows to an external balcony. Can you see what I'm getting at? What are the 5 dirty windows? The senses. Hmm? What is the external courtyard? And the mirror? The mind. What is the lamp that burns brightly? Your Atma Buddhi, your higher self. Alright? So, the synopsis now of the story of human evolution. We can relate this, of course, in a more boring sense, in terms of all these tables. But sometimes I think it's very useful to look at things in a more symbolic way. The 5 dirty senses, the external world, the inner courtyard, the pranalinga sharira, the mirror, the mind principle, the monad, the lamp, and manas. Okay? So, a synopsis of human evolution. We are the joint activity of 2 classes of divine hosts. One who gave us consciousness, and the other who gave us form. There is always this polarity between spirit and matter, consciousness and form, mind and brain, physiology and anatomy, astrology and astronomy. One always sees this polarity. These all express the idea of a principle and something that must express and channel and contain that principle. So a synopsis of all the root races on one sheet of paper, so to speak. We have intelligent, self-conscious humans produced by the joint activity of the lunar Petries, the lunar fathers, whose prime function was to produce forms for the monads awaiting incarnation. Their method was Kriya Shakti, the yogic powers using the mind, the power of thought producing external results. And so the first root race was called mind-born or will-born, and their activity was the lunar Petries shot out or breathed out from their ethereal bodies their chayas, their shadows. Chaya means shadows, still more ethereal forms of themselves. And this was the first dwelling place of the monads. The chayas were mindless. The rupa or form, they were the rupa or form of functioning man, or future man. His mind was there, but it was not functioning. It was not switched on. Whatever is enabled to function must be in a latent state. You cannot switch on what cannot be switched on in the first place. You can't turn the light on, there's no electricity. So, the third root race was self-born. I don't know which root race mosquitoes and flies appear, but in some ways they do. Sorry. The first root race was self-born from the shadows of their progenitors. Now, the solar Petries are the lords of the flame who intervened in the third root race to activate the latent mind of man. And we'll come to that. Note, the lunar Petries are also referred to as Varishads. Each name in Sanskrit throws a light on some particular activity or function. Varishad means sitting by the fire. Why sitting by the fire? What is the fire? Fire symbolizes mind. The Varishads were sitting by the fire because they couldn't turn the fire on. They were only able to sit by the fire because they were not able to activate the fire of the mind. So you see how one word in Sanskrit will open up a whole spectrum of meaning. And I find it very sad when people sort of start revolting at the use of Sanskrit terms without understanding the sheer depth of meaning that they convey. Varishad, sitting by the fire, because the lunar Petries had not reached the stage of being able to awaken the fire, they were termed Varishads, and that awakening was done by the solar Petries. So So the first root race of man was produced by the lunar Petries, the lunar fathers, the solar fire, which was called into being by the earth, and the animal electricity called into being by the Barishas. The lunar Petries provided the form for the indwelling monad, the breath. The gross body was provided by the earth, and the prana jiva, the vitality, the spirit of life, was provided by the solar lahas, the lesser solar gods, the solar lahas, who breathed it into the form. The kamarupa, the vehicle of desire, was provided by the lunar Petries. But the mind to embrace the universe? No, they couldn't do that. So man was senseless, he was senseless. 3 principles for a rupa, but man was senseless. So, again, relating it to this diagram, man had 3 principles, but he had no mind to embrace the universe. So first root race man was not physical, obviously, he was rudimentary. And let's have a look at first root race man. His reproduction was by a process known as fission, in the same way as an amoeba is divided by a fission process. They were called self-born because the shadows of the lunar Petries were exuded from the parent entity by Kriya Shakti. The sense that they had was a form of hearing. Where is the sense? Sense developed sound, hearing. The element corresponding to that was ether. And remember I said yesterday that sound is the first, or the hearing is the first sense to develop in the unborn baby. Well, it was the first sense to develop in the first root race. So you see this beautiful correspondence between what happened in the outer is now happening in the inner. The element is ether, and the continent, we're told, is the North Pole cap. Bearing in mind, of course, the Earth was in a very, very different shape then as it is now. So the 7 stages of the evolution of man, Shakespeare was not the only one who talked about the 7 ages of man. If we move to the second root race now, the first root race was born by, or reproduced by a process of fission. In the second root race, the reproduction was rather, the early second root race was fission like the amoeba, but the later second root race, they were known as sweat-born. Sweat-born by a process of sort of budding. Even some fruits these days reproduce by a sort of budding process. The sense they developed was touch, and the element was air, and the continent were the promontories south and west from the North Pole, the Hyperborean continent, the age, the so-called age of the Titans. So if we have a look here, the first root race was sexless, the second root race was asexual. There's a difference. Sexless means no sex. Asexual means no sexual propensity. There is a difference. The continent was Hyperborea. Now the height, according to HBB, according to the statues at Bhumi, were 320 feet and 150 feet. The sense developed was from sound to touch. The element corresponding, ether to air. The language developed, well, the first root race had no language. The second, a sound language, a bit like chanting. Okay? And the activity of the lunar Petries was really in this first root race. The solar Petries had not done anything by then or at that stage. Around race, principle of man, sense, element, all develop from latency into objectivity. So the third round emphasis is on water. The third round, yes, is on the water element, and the fourth present round emphasis is on earth. The principle, of course, as I said, the fourth round was Kama. The element is earth. Now we come to the third root race, which is really the most important because assistance was provided. And Blavatsky talks of panspermic. She uses this word, panspermic. Now, the occult teachings are preeminently panspermic. The doctrine that parent germs produce all the microcosmic organisms, and it is opposed to the theory of spontaneous generation. That there is no such thing as dead matter. So the lunar Petries represent the class who had accomplished on the lunar planetary system the stage comparable to human evolution, and they were therefore able, at their stage of manifesting in physical bodies, the chayas they produced by Kriya Shakti were not physical bodies, but comparable to the Linga Sharira in us. So the second principle in us, the Linga Sharira, is correlated to the chayas. So it is a universal tradition that mankind has evolved into its present shape from an almost transparent condition of texture, neither by miracle nor by sexual intercourse. Moreover, this is in full accord with the ancient philosophies of Egypt, India, with their divine dynasties down to Plato. For a tradition which has a uniform and universal existence has all the weight of scientific authenticity, all the weight of scientific testimony. And there is more than one such tradition in the Puranic allegories. In the Zohar, we find the shadow image of Elohim, the Petries, was made Adam, the man. So the whole point of the secret doctrine is to provide scientific evidence by drawing together all these various traditions. And if our friend Osho thinks that that's just like assembling bits and pieces of various traditions and stuffing it together, he's completely missing the point. Because in all these instances that Blavatsky cites, there is a common thread, there is a common essence that runs through it. The first race, self-born, which are the astral shadows of their progenitors, the body was devoid of all understanding, the inner being, the higher self, monad, though within the earthly frame, was unconnected with it. And the monad is stated to be unconnected with the earthly frame because the link, the manas, or the mind principle, although present, was not functioning or energized, hence not there as yet. So to summarize, HBB says on this whole question of panspermic, the progressive order, the method of reproduction, is a brilliant confirmation of esoteric ethnology. We have fission, as seen in the division of the homogeneous spark of protoplasm, as seen in the division of the nucleated cell, and that was the way the first root race reproduced. We have budding. A small proportion of the parent structure swells out like a boil on the surface, and finally parts company, growing to the size of the original organism, like many vegetables now. That's how the second root race reproduced. The latter half, the second root race. We have spores, a single cell thrown off, reproducing the feature of its original parent. And then we have intermediate hermaphrodism, the male and female organ inhering in the same individual. The majority of plants, worms and snails, etc., this is allied to budding, which is the way the late second and early third root races reproduced. And then we have true sexual union. So, by tracing the sequence of events, one can hardly say that all of this is tosh and figment of the imagination, and as one of our scientists in Australia says, psychic imaginations of HPB. If you don't want to look at the evidence, then you're not qualified to talk. And it really is as simple as that. So, the late second root race and early third root race reproduced by budding, they were sweat-born. The middle third root race were egg-born as the hermaphrodite. Androgynous at first, with no particular gender, and then a preponderance of male or female gender. Then the separation occurred, true sexual union. And that's when our trouble starts. So the third root race, the early part sweat-born, the middle part egg-born, the third part sexual union. The first part is, like the second, asexual, no sexual propensity. The second is bisexual, both equally in you. And the third, true sexual. The continent, of course, Bilimoria, and never mind the height, varies. The sense developed was sight. The corresponding element is fire. Now, assistance was provided to this race. Now, why assistance? If we go back then, as always, to our key diagram, we needed a connection between the monad in general and the physical earthly frame. The mirror had to be provided, the mind principle. So, without the mirror, the lamp has no way of throwing its beams out into the physical world. The lamp just burns unto itself. So the lunar Pitris could not awaken the dormant mind of man, manas. That energizing had to be done by superior beings, the solar Pitris. The solar Pitris are really one host acting under three names, typifying three functions: the Kumaras, the Agnishattas, and the Manasaputras. Now, in a very, very simple example, the Kumaras, the original purity, the Agnishvatas, sweetened by the fire, Manasaputras, the bringers of mind. Now, any teacher acts in the same way. If you have a gifted musical pupil, then that is the Kumaric state, that is a latent state of musicality. It's only latent, you can't do anything with it. When you decide to teach your pupil, you act as a Manasaputra. You are bringing mind to it, you're bringing something to it. And then when your pupil works hard, he is like an Agnishvata, he is sweetened by the fire of damn hard work. So there is one principle at work acting in three different ways. So don't think this class of hosts, where you're a separate load of angels floating around. It's one class of hosts serving different functions. So as I say, don't we act as father, son, teacher, brother, whatever, even though we are one person. And what they did, the Solar Pitris, was to incarnate, so to speak, into a proportion of the third root race, and so create thinking, self-conscious, divine man. Now, if that seems ridiculous, does not every parent overshadow its newborn infant? Does it not breathe its essence into the baby? Every parent does that. Every teacher does that to his pupil. Is not some aspect, not just physical, of your parent or mentor also in you? Do you not carry some aspect of someone you love, or someone who's meant a lot to you? They breathe something into you, haven't they? So the whole key to the mystery of evil and the fall of the angels is contained in this tremendous Shloka 24, which we will go through slowly. So the key to the mystery of evil and the inequalities of mind, birth and social position. This is slightly adapted, which is the whole key to the mystery of evil, the so-called fall of the angels, and the many problems that have puzzled the brains of philosophers from the time that the memory of man began. It solves the secret of the subsequent inequalities of intellectual capacity, birth, social position. Why? Why? Because up to the fourth round, and even in the later part of the third, man, if we can call the ever-changing forms that the monad was clothing, in the first 2.5 races of the present one, man is only an animal intellectually. It is only in the actual midway round, the fourth round, half-fourth round, that he develops in himself entirely the fourth principle, karma, as a fit vehicle for the fifth manas. But manas will be relatively fully developed only in the following fifth round, but never mind that. Now, as the stanzas tell us, the sons of wisdom, the sons of night, issuing from the body of Brahma, when it became night, ready for rebirth, came down. The sons of wisdom are the solar pitris, the manasaputras. When it became night means the sons of wisdom were active in a previous manvantara. They were active in a previous manvantara. They, the sons of wisdom, saw the intellectually vile forms of the first third, the still senseless or mindless race. The first third are the first sub-race of the third root race. The first sub-race of the third root race. In other words, this early part of the third root race. Then the Lords of the Wisdom said, we can choose, we have wisdom, but when a choice is made, karmic consequences follow. We have wisdom means the manas principle was fully awakened prior to this manvantara in the Lords of the Wisdom. Some entered the trials, some of the Lords of Wisdom entered the trials. These monads were ready and became the arhats and sages of the race. Some of the Lords of Wisdom projected a spark. Those who received but a spark remained destitute of high knowledge. The spark burned low. It means these monads were half ready and will have to acquire full intellectuality during the present manvantara. Some deferred to the fourth, the Atlantean race. Some Manasaputras deferred their incarnation until the Atlantean race, which was then tainted with sin. And this produced a terrible karmic consequence because the bodies they had to inform had become defiled by bestiality through their own procrastination. Now I know this is a heavy slide, but in essence, the solar pitris fully informed the fully prepared trials, the monads were fully prepared, and these became the arhats, the sages of the future races. And I would say the geniuses, some monads were half prepared, a little spark was projected, in the same way as the greatest teacher can only project into his pupil what the pupil is ready to receive. You can have lessons from Daniel Barenboim. If you can't play your C major scale, he can't do anything with you. So it's exactly the same. If you're prepared, the teacher can give everything to you. If you're half prepared, he'll give you half. And if you're not prepared, well, he'll say, sugar off and go somewhere else, or something like that. But with terrible consequences. So from their own essence, they filled, intensified the karma, the vehicle of desire. This stresses the importance of desire as the base from manas. And now, most important, the third remained mindless. The monads were not ready. These were set apart among the seven. They became the narrow-headed. In other words, those monads, not at all ready, were not informed. They were not, their mind principle could not be switched or did not get switched on by the solar Petries, and they remained the narrow-brained. These monads were the latest who had barely evolved from their last transitional and lower animal form at the close of the third round. And the third were ready. In these shall we dwell, said the Lords of the Flame and the Dark Wisdom. So the Lords chose to dwell in the prepared fifth subrace of the third root race after the separation of sexes had occurred. So again, to keep it simple, a full projection, a semi-projection, a non-projection. Now, the evolution of animals. In Genesis, the Puranas, the Egyptian wisdom, all in accord with the secret doctrine. For example, in Genesis, the animals, whales, fowls of the air created before androgynous Adam. Then Adam, sexless, comes first, and the animals, at least the mammals, appear after him. So animals from the previous third round were the sort of cast-off life atoms. And the animals first were ethereal proto-organisms like man. Then, during the third race, the boneless became the boned. In other words, there was a densification and a crystallization. The chayas, the shadows, solidified, all in accordance with the descending arc of evolution from spirit into matter. Now, of course, we're supposed to be on the returning arc. Now, like man, the animals were also hermaphrodite. Then the animals separated into male and female, and they bred. After that, the twofold androgynous man also separated into male and female and began to breed. Big but, remember that the solar Petries refused to incarnate in the proportion of the race. So those that had no spark in them, those of the separated men that had no spark in them, that had not had the mind principle awakened, the so-called mindless or narrow-headed men were unable to distinguish their type from the behavior of the animals. So, imitating the animals, they mated with these huge she-animals and produced the dumb races. And this unnatural human-animal cross-breeding being the result of the Lords of the Wisdom choosing not to undertake their responsibility, and therefore originating in time the lowest specimens of humanity. And this is known as the first sin of the mindless. The first sin of the mindless, the karma of which lay not with narrow-headed man, because he did not have his mind yet, but it lay with the Lords of the Wisdom, for which we're told they paid, or paying, a dreadful price. then over time, this bestiality and the mating of the bestiality offspring resulted in the mammalian apes, not the anthropod apes. It's not much different now. Don't scientists experiment with human animal embryos? I find that utterly repulsive. We are really reenacting the filth and the mindlessness of the previous races, but in full mindfulness now. Even, now, if we do something utterly brainless, what do we say? We've lost our mind, we have no intelligence, we have these words in English. Now, the medical Hippocratic Oath is one example of an obligation of the doctor to incarnate fully into the problems of his patient. Isn't that the Hippocratic Oath? I don't care whether you're a beggar or a king, if you have a problem, I will help you. So, if you have sworn this and you fail this duty, there is a price to pay. So science's assertion that man is an animal is a half-truth unbeknown to science. Man came from the animal, but is certainly not a mammal. Came from the animal means that the monad, cycling through the kingdoms of nature, inhabited to experience the animal and then the human kingdom, previously of course the mineral and vegetable kingdom. It does not mean man was an animal previously. An animal did not turn into man by mutations of genes. The missing link, what biologists have singularly failed to discover, is this. The separation of sexes in animals and later on in man did not occur suddenly because nature operates slowly. Remember that men and animals were then physiologically, of course, very different from now. These early primitive men were the missing link, primitive lower man of whom obviously no fossil bones remain. The missing link is from man to ape, not from ape to man. And this stage represents the first fall into matter, the fall of man, the separation of third root race, animal man. Again, remember that the mind principle had not been kick-started for these lower developed specimens of the third root race. So, at the separation of the sexes, after the middle part of the third root race, a proportion of the race was still mindless. A proportion of the race was mindless, and this had enormous repercussions later on. And therefore, further assistance had to be provided. So because of the inadequate assistance provided by the solar Petries, the lords, to the early third root race, tragic consequences ensued. Seeing the sin committed with the animals by the mindless, these solar Petries who had refused to create man then wept because their future abode, the shell of man created by the lunar Petries, had become defiled. Therefore, lest worse should happen, they then incarnated into the mindless. But at this later stage of incarnation of the solar Petries, this occurred during the fourth race, when the race had already separated, unconsciously sinned, and then unnatural consequences ensued. So from now on, the mind principle was no longer dormant, but functioning consciously. So again, let's get back to our final slide on the third root race. True sexual union here. The continent Lemuria, the sense-developed sight corresponding to fire. Now, after the incarnation of the solar Petries, the language developed was first monosyllabic, agglutinative, which means words sticking together like glue, and then finally inflectional, which is the root of the Senzar Sanskrit. The height is supposed to be 60 feet roughly after the fall, then down to 20 or 25 feet. Now, the solar peat trees, the two infusions of mind into the senseless man occurred during this whole part of the third root race into a proportion of the race, and then later on, which I'll quickly touch on now. The third race, we're told, was destroyed by subterranean fire and geological cataclysms, and the evidence of the continent from ancient traditions of India, Greece, Malaysia, Sumatra, Java, Polynesia, America, all records preserved in secret annals and comprehensible only to the highest occultist, because such texts have got to be understood on at least 3 levels of reality: the realistic, the idealistic, and the divine, corresponding to the terrestrial, the human soul, and the spirit. So all texts have got to be understood on at least these 3 levels: the realistic, the idealistic, and the divine. Now, the fourth root race. What happens? What is the danger? What is the downside when the mind principle is awakened and the intellect awakened and function? What happens? Of course, we have intelligence and great science and all that. What's the downside? Pride, arrogance, conceit, yes? And all of that happened during the Atlantean, the fourth root race. The first completely human race as we now have, as we're told, though immensely larger in physical stature. So the fourth root race is this. The fall into generation, full sexual union, continent of Atlantis, of course. The sense developed goes from sound, touch, sight to taste. The element developed was water, the language was proper speech, and this was another occasion when further assistance was provided by the Lords of the Flame, lest further sin and further horrible consequences should ensue. So initially pure, the race progressed. As it progressed, it became, as we're told, black with sin for various reasons. Again, let me re-emphasize that when the solar peat trees came to incarnate the first time, some incarnated fully, others projected a spark, while some of the shadows were not filled into the fourth race. And those races that were left mindless or destitute of knowledge remained so even after the separation of the sexes. And it is these who committed the first crossbreeding with the she-animals and so bred monsters, and it is from the descendants of these crossbreedings that the Atlanteans chose their wives. So the Atlanteans then renewed the sin of the mindless, but this time with full mindfulness and responsibility, because then their mind principle had been fully awakened, but they chose their wives from the descendants of the bestiality productions of the earlier race. So here the karma lay not with the Lords, but with the Atlanteans, and the result of their crime was not the mammalian apes, but the anthropoid apes. So what are the iniquities? The misuse of occult and psychic powers, white magic degenerated into sorcery, tales of the Atlantic sorcerers abound. Now, dreadful things happen in science, wonderful things as well. Dreadful things happen, which for me is really is the scientific equivalent of the misuse of occult power by the later Atlanteans. The horrible animal experimentation, you know, I'm not going to go into the details. The secret doctrine speaks of the terrible sidereal force known to the Atlanteans as Mashmak, and by, as she says, a term we do not wish to mention, because you give out a word and you have power, or you give power. Now, the Astra-vidya of India concerns the science of warfare, when such warfare is concerned solely with the everlasting struggle of the adepts of the right hand with those of the left. And you will find loud echoes of this in the Ramayana epic. The Astra-vidya, of course, is in a secret language which is pure gobbledygook to other than an initiate, because secret means sacred, and sacred has to be preserved from the profane. So the achievements of the Lemurians and early Atlanteans, under the guidance of their divine rulers, they built cities, knew astronomy, architecture, and mathematics to perfection. The pyramids, we're told. We have the stories of the Vimanas, the chariot. Ravana, the king of Lanka, abducted Sita in his Vimana called Pushpa, and took her to Lanka. There is an incredible video by Hoagland, who was a NASA scientist, who shows us structures on the moon that are so pretty obviously man-made. There are huge shards of glass, hundreds of feet in height, and by the most minute analysis of optics and crystallography and the positioning of the objects against the light at all angles, there is no way that one can conclude that these objects are other than non-natural or man-made or whoever made it. And he obtained it by gathering the censored film from the Hasselblad camera. Don't forget, when the men went to the moon, they didn't have digital photography. They had the Hasselblad camera, so they snipped out the offending bits, because a great big council decided in their wisdom that to give out this information would destabilize the population. But he has written a book, he has shown the pictures, and there is a very detailed video of these glass and other structures on the moon. Well worth watching. Again, it alludes...
Name of this one?
Hoagland, Hoagland. Again, it alludes to the fact that intelligence is everywhere, we are not alone. And this obsession of science to find life on other planets, there is only life, but not life in the way you look at it, sort of biological life and, carnal life. So, Atlantis was supposed to be a huge horseshoe-shaped continent that America joined to India. Presumably India would not suffer from subprime mortgage problems if that happened. And the eastern end far more northward than North Cornwall. What we are told of the heights of these early men come from the initiates of the fourth root race and are to be found in Bani in India. Now, I mentioned the age of giants. In India we have the Danavas and the Rakshasas. In Greece we have the Titans. In India we have the Danavas and the Daityas. In Ceylon we have the Rakshasas of the Ramayana war. In Egypt we have the heroes, Chaldea the Nimrod, and ancient Egypt and amongst the Jews, think of Moses and Goliath. So we have the giant tradition in all the races, in all the cultures. So the doom of Atlantis was by flood, cataclysms occurring not at all according to chance, but according to law at the appointed time, not at all blindly, as science seems to think, but in according to karmic and harmony. Law in occultism is referred to as the great adjuster, And Newton, in his Principia, talks about the world system functioning until it needs an adjustment. Lovely word, until it needs an adjustment. A wonderful sort of 4-page chilling account of the doom of Atlantis is given to us by Brunton in his Night in the Pyramid, where, well, I can almost quote that chapter verbatim, but the essence of what he was told by the priest king, by the Hierophant in vision, was it was not the creator that caused the doom of these islands, but it was man's own iniquity. The creator loves all, but he has set certain laws over man. And when man breaks these laws, there has to be this adjustment. But then he says, go back and set these words down in words known to man. This is why masters seem to prefer journalists, Sinnett or Brunton. Both are journalists. They know how to set things down in words known to man. Have you thought of it? Brunton a journalist, Sinnett a journalist. Masters like journalists for obvious reasons. They're very practical people. So the fifth race, the Aryan, the majority of mankind still shows the characteristic of the last 7th sub-race of the 4th. Arya means truth, of course, not the ghastly distortion attached to that sacred name by those who perpetrated the last World War, whose name I will not choose to mention. And there is still, by the way, in Discovery channels, a lot of debate about whether the Nazis were influenced by Blavatsky or not, and therefore, in the totally naive way, they put the connection there. One might as well say that because the atomic bomb draws on nuclear physics, and nuclear physics draws on, earlier on the work of Newton and Galileo, and Newton and Galileo was responsible for the atomic bomb. It's as utterly idiotic as that. Any monster, any tyrant will use any sacred teaching, twist it and uglify it for their own purpose. To think that they played Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, All Men Are Brothers, excuse me, to think that they took people to be shot to the sound of Wagner's Overture to the Meistersingers. Beethoven, so are they going to make a link between Beethoven and the Nazis? Are we descending to that level of stupidity? And I only mention that because there will be, I hope, a recent television program where the record between the Nazi phenomenon and the secret doctrine of Blavatsky has been set right. And I hope you will watch it just for that reason. But just coming on to the fifth group race, which is the simplest, actually. Sexual union, of course. The second sin of the mindless, conducted or performed by the Atlanteans, was there. In the fifth group race, of course, there isn't that. Planet Earth. The sense goes from sound, touch, sight, taste, and finally smell. And the element is earth. And the language goes from nothing to sacred sounds, to monosyllabic and agglutinative speech, to inflectional speech, to true speech in the Atlantean times. And now the language we have is silly emails and text messages. That's our contribution to language. Of course, in the sixth and seventh group races, we're told very little other than the sense developed will be normal clairvoyance, whatever it means, normal, and instant perception, and there you have intuition, of course. So the fifth group race was formed from the holy stock of the fourth group race, rather like you make your yogurt or anything else from the holy stock of something else. And in its early stages, it was ruled by its divine instructors, the Rishis, the Kaviris, and the Nagas of India, or the priest-king pharaohs and hierophants of Egypt. These instructed the early race. For example, the Kabiri in the science of agriculture, especially the growing of corn. Gods and dragons are the names given to these priest kings. We have the gods of Egypt, or the Hindu pantheon, the rishis, or Mount Olympus. These gods really are the septiform, the sevenfold personifications, the personifications of noumena, the intelligent powers of nature, cosmic forces, celestial bodies, gods or Dhantrahams, psychic and spiritual powers, divine kings on earth, and terrestrial heroes. So the word God is a multifaceted term. It is really a word that embraces or subsumes all of these principles depending on which level you're operating. So the teachings in the secret doctrine are corroborated because we find priests assuming the names of the gods they served, and the dragons held throughout antiquity as the symbols of immortality and wisdom, of secret knowledge and of eternity. The Hierophants of Egypt and India styling themselves generally as sons of the dragon and serpents. Their abode was in caves or pyramid-type structures, not just in Egypt, but the Americas and elsewhere. And I suppose the last cave where the greatest holy man meditated for almost 15 years was on the hill of God. You know it. Arunachala. I spent only 30 minutes where Ramana Maharshi spent almost 14 years. And I love the story that in his moments of high samadhi, let's scroll down, a large local tiger would come and lick the young sage's hand, and such is the power of these great people that the wildest of beasts will be completely loving and benign towards them. So, here ends our tale, and I leave you then with these ennobling and uplifting message from arguably then India's last Maharishi, the last great Rishi, arguably, of the great Aryan tradition, the last great Rishi, none other than Ramana Maharshi, where he says, the greatest error of man is to think that he is evil by nature, or weak by nature. Every man is divine and strong in his real nature. What are weak and evil are his habits, his desires and his thoughts, but not himself.
Mm-hmm. And that's what the Emerald Tablet says. In different words. Exactly the same thing.
That's the beauty. And to use my own, just to, every great person has dipped his pen into the one universal ink well. He's taken the same ink, but he has written it in his own handwriting. So Mozart will write it with the same ink in the handwriting of music, and Newton will do it in the handwriting of mathematics or poetry, whatever. But the ink is one.